Christians claim that Jesus Christ rose from the dead, that he was resurrected 3 days after his death on the cross. To prove this, they argue that his own disciples died for him. Their logic is, if Jesus had not truly risen, his disciples would not have willingly faced death for him. Therefore, they say the deaths of his disciples prove that Jesus rose from the dead. In our previous video, we showed why the claim that his disciples died for their faith is historically unreliable and based on legends. Many Christians responded by presenting several proofs that the disciples actually died for him, claiming that this validates both the resurrection and Christianity itself. Here are 2 sample comments visible on the screen that contain 7 specific claims from Christian apologists. In this video, we will break down these 7 so-called proofs one by one. You will see how each of them turns out to be unreliable, false, or twisted, and how Christianity keeps itself alive by spreading such fake claims. Let's list the claims and address them one by one. Claim number 1. There are independent records of persecution from Roman officials themselves. Pliny, Tacitus, Suetonius. Claim number 2. The book of Acts in the Bible documents James being executed by Herod. Claim number 3. Clement of Rome in 95 AD confirms Peter and Paul were killed in Rome. Claim number 4. Early non-biblical writers like Polycarp, Ignatius, and Irenaeus repeatedly reference the apostles' martyrdom as a known fact. Claim number 5. Why would anyone invent humiliating deaths for their leaders? Propaganda glorifies founders, not crucifixions or stoning. Claim number 6. People die for lies all the time, but the apostles supposedly knew the resurrection was true, so their deaths are proof. Claim number 7. The Jewish historian Josephus, in his work Antiquities of the Jews, mentions James's death. Now let's see why these claims are unreliable, false, or misrepresented. Claim number 1. Roman sources Pliny, Tacitus, and Suetonius. Yes, these writers mention Christians, but notice carefully. Pliny the Younger wrote about interrogating Christians in Bithynia, but he didn't mention about apostles or their martyrdom. Tacitus mentions Nero persecuting Christians after the fire of Rome, but provides no details about apostles or eyewitness accounts. Suetonius notes disturbances at the instigation of Rustus, which may not even refer to Jesus, let alone his disciples. So the bottom line is, none of these sources mention Peter, Paul, James, or any apostle. They only confirm that Christians existed and were sometimes persecuted. Christian apologists stretch these mentions into proof of apostolic martyrdom, but the sources themselves say nothing of the sort. Claim number 2. The book of Acts in chapter 12 verse 2 mentions the death of James executed by Herod. Yes, Acts mentions James's death. I already cited that in my earlier video, and I explained that since the Bible is full of unfounded stories, we have no reason to believe this story in the Bible about James's death. But here is the bigger problem. These Christians are quoting Acts chapter 12 verse 2 to prove the resurrection of Jesus. If Acts chapter 12 verse 2 in the Bible is true, then the resurrection stories in the Gospel should also be true. Then why don't they point to the Gospels instead of Acts chapter 12 verse 2 to prove the resurrection? Quoting Acts to defend the resurrection actually admits the Gospel stories are unreliable. If the resurrection were truly historical, Acts would not be needed. So the conclusion is, Acts chapter 12 verse 2 does not prove apostles' martyrdom. It highlights how faulty the resurrection narrative in the Bible is. Claim number 3. Clement of Rome confirms Peter and Paul were killed in Rome. Clement was a late 1st century Christian leader. Yes, Clement of Rome in 95 AD mentions Peter and Paul as examples of endurance, saying they suffered and were martyred. However, there are several problems. Today, Christians confidently claim with certainty that Peter was martyred in Rome under Nero in 64 AD. This Clement's letter was written around 95 AD, about 30 years after Peter and Paul were supposedly died under Nero. Now watch the timing of New Testament books. Paul's genuine letters were written before 64 AD. The Gospel of Mark was written between 65 to 70 AD. Matthew, Luke, and Acts were written between 80 to 90 AD. And John, the Gospel of John, was written between 90 to 100 AD. So many of the New Testament books were written after Peter and Paul were supposedly died under Nero. Yet, none of them record the deaths of Peter or Paul. And more importantly, in the Gospel of John, that was written after 90 AD, decades after Peter's supposed death, presents Peter's death only as a prediction in John chapter 21 and not as a fulfillment. If Peter had already been martyred, the author could have confirmed it as a historical fact, but instead leaves it as an open-ended, vague prophecy. So the Christian claim that Peter was martyred in Rome under Nero in 64 AD has no historical proof. The claim rests on later apocryphal books such as the Acts of Peter, writings which the church itself has officially rejected as heretical. So the very sources Christians depend on for details of Peter's death are the same sources the church has dismissed as untrustworthy. So the conclusion is, Clement's account is unreliable. The silence of the New Testament books, including John's vague prophecy written after Peter's supposed death, shows that Peter's Nero-era martyrdom was not historical. So there is no historical proof that Peter died as a martyr. Claim number 4. Early non-biblical writers like Polycarp, Ignatius, and Irenaeus repeatedly reference the apostles' martyrdom as a known fact, not as legend. Christian apologists cite early Christian leaders Polycarp, Ignatius, and Irenaeus as confirming apostolic martyrdom. But closer examination shows Ignatius and Polycarp emphasize faithfulness unto death but provide no details of apostles' deaths. Apostles are cited as moral examples, not documented martyrs. Irenaeus explicitly claims Peter and Paul were martyred in Rome. But there are 3 problems. Irenaeus wrote around 180 CE, referring to Nero's persecution in Rome. This confirms that Peter's supposed martyrdom was said to have happened around 64 AD, raising the question why the New Testament books written after 64 AD did not mention Peter's death. Again, John's vague prophecy about Peter's death written in 90 AD proves that Peter was not martyred around 64 AD and invalidates Clement's claim. By the time of Irenaeus, apocryphal texts like the Acts of Peter and Acts of Paul dramatized apostolic deaths. Peter crucified upside down, Paul beheaded. These apocryphal books were the actual sources of the Christian church's claim that all of Jesus' disciples died for their faith. We already explained in the other video why that claim is false based on the nature of those apocryphal books. So the conclusion is, these early non-biblical references reflect legend and ideology, not historical fact. Claim number 5. Why would anyone invent humiliating deaths for their own leaders? Christian apologists argue that the stories of the disciples' martyrdom must be true because no one would deliberately invent such embarrassing or humiliating endings for their heroes. But this argument collapses under its own weight. No one denies that Jesus died a humiliating death by crucifixion. What is in question is the claim that he rose again. In fact, his humiliating death is precisely why the resurrection story would have been invented, to turn a shameful defeat into a supposed victory. So, once that interpretation is in place, there is no reason why early Christians could not also invent humiliating deaths for their leaders. Just as Jesus' humiliation was reframed as glory, so too could the apostles' deaths be reframed as proof of loyalty and faithfulness. Therefore, the claim that no one would invent humiliating deaths is meaningless in defending the resurrection. Claim number 6. People die for lies they believe to be true all the time. But the apostles were in the unique position of knowing if it was true or not. Yet they died refusing to deny the resurrection. That's what makes their testimony stand apart. So the Christian argument here is the disciples knew the resurrection was true. Their deaths prove it. According to this argument, the disciples preached that they had seen the resurrected Jesus. If Jesus had not truly risen, Then, when facing death, the disciples could have admitted they were lying and avoided execution. But they didn't do that. They never said, "We lied, sorry, please don't kill us." In other words, they were supposedly in a unique position to know whether the resurrection was true. Their willingness to die for this claim is then presented as proof that Jesus actually rose from the dead. At first glance, this argument may seem persuasive. However, it collapses once we compare it to other religions and cults. I will give you some examples. The Heaven's Gate cult in 1997, their leaders and disciples believed a spaceship was behind the Hale-Bopp comet. If anyone could have realized it was not real, it was them. Yet, they committed mass suicide anyway. Number 2, Jonestown cult in 1978. Jim Jones's lieutenants knew about his staged healings, but many still died in the mass suicide convinced of his mission. Number 3, Joseph Smith's associates, Mormonism. Their inner circle swore they saw golden plates and angelic visions. Some faced persecution and violence. Yet, we know Smith fabricated much of his story. Their willingness to suffer proves nothing. So the lesson is clear. People die for lies all the time, even people who should know better. So the disciples being in a unique position doesn't prove the resurrection. It only proves that they were human beings caught in a powerful religious movement, just like countless others throughout history. Claim number 7. Josephus, the Jewish historian in the 1st century AD, mentions James's death. Christian apologists cite his work Antiquities of the Jews, written between 93 to 94 AD, which mentions the execution of James, the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ. But it's a very poor case. First of all, this James was not an apostle, not a disciple of Jesus. Secondly, the James in Josephus is Jesus' brother or close kin and a leader in the Jerusalem church. He is not James, son of Zebedee, who was mentioned in Acts 12:2. Apologists often conflate the two to inflate evidence for apostolic martyrdom, but historically, they are distinct individuals. Reason for James's death, according to Josephus. James was executed by Ananus, the high priest, during a political power vacuum after the death of Roman procurator Festus. He was accused of transgressing Jewish law. This was a judicial punishment by Jewish leadership, not Roman persecution for belief in Jesus. So, Josephus does not present James as dying for belief in the resurrection or as a heroic martyr for the gospel. His execution was part of internal Jewish political and religious tensions, not Christian theological validation. So the conclusion is all 7 so-called proofs presented by Christian apologists fail under scrutiny. Roman records, biblical texts, early Christian writings, and Josephus either say nothing about apostles dying for the resurrection or reflect later legends and theological motives. Even the apologetic logic about humiliation, eyewitness deaths, or the disciples' unique position does not hold. In fact, these claims confirm the point made in our previous video. The resurrection story is based on the supposed deaths of Jesus' disciples, and when we see that there is no historical evidence for their deaths, it once again confirms that the resurrection story is built on completely unreliable and fictional grounds.